Good afternoon and welcome back to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation, and we're configuring the human resource module. Today we're going to talk about the terminate task that you can execute from Dynamics 365. In my previous video we talked about the change in position, so kind of gave you some of the inputs, some of the things that you should know in order for you to have a proper conversation with the client on the functionalities that are available within this module. So with that, we'll execute the termination task of an employee, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can and cannot do and what are the things that you should be mindful of. So we'll pick Alicia. In our previous video, we picked Alicia to change the position. Of course, I don't tend to execute the task all the way to the end because that is for something that I would like you to do, and perhaps even come up with some of the comments at the comment section and give me a scenario-based question on what you think should be a possible solution to it. So more than happy to provide my insight on my experience, on the things that I know for a fact from a market perspective, and what are the different functionalities that are available, maybe even workarounds that I can even propose to you if it's applicable. So most of my videos are always like that. So that's how I tend to teach students that I've been teaching through my MCT certification and through a lot of my mentoring as I do. So we'll select Alicia once again, and I'll click on the terminate. And so remember that from an HR manager perspective, they would have an access to this HR module, and that's based on the licenses. And this is another conversation that you would need to have with your client at some point, but licenses do matter, of course. That allows you to move around the system quite a bit, right? So if you don't have the right licenses, then you may not be able to execute the task that I am executing from this form. So that's very crucial to understand. We'll talk about where else you can do change position and termination based on different types of licenses, of course, but that's something that we will foresee sometime in the future. Our focus is we would execute every single task as an HR manager who should have full license to this HR module. So within the active employee form, I select Alicia and I click on terminate. So now I want to terminate her employment. Once you terminate, a new form comes up and you would execute that based on the termination date. So you can do a future dated, you can also do a past dated, or you can make it effective as of today. You want to make sure that these dates are very accurate because everything is run on the basis of a date, effective date for that matter. Of course, the payroll is dependent on these effective dates. So in our case, we can leave it as 30th, for instance. You could see the last date work automatically got populated. When we talked about the employee profile, I showed you under the work history that the last day worked is same thing as a termination day, but you can change this last day work. So I also gave you an example in one of my implementations where the last day work used to come from another integration point from a payroll where it was most up to date. So that was the source of truth. And we built an integration in F&O to have this date updated. So we are aligned with the payroll system and the Dynamics system. So this field can be edited and it can be changed. So I can change it to 28, for instance, and it has no impact on the termination date. The status obviously gets automatically changed to terminated. And this status we also talked about in the employee profile. So, I can stay as employed and it has no relevance. It will not tell me or prompt me with an error saying that, oh, we are executing a termination task, yet the status is employee. So that is also a standalone. Talked a little bit about the impact of it. And so if you want to know a little bit more about that, do go through that configuration video where I talked about the status under the work history. So that's also relevant. So that's how we're going to start tying things together now from the configuration. That's why I kind of encourage you to go through those videos as well, just so you know what we're talking about and how things are interlinked. So in here, we'll just keep it as is for status as terminated. We need a termination reason, not absolutely necessary because it doesn't have the abstract there. So it's not a mandatory field, but for reporting purposes, for tracking, you should have a termination user code associated with this termination. We'll just say voluntary resignation. And this is the rehire button. So we talked about the rehire button, and we said that this is simply a toggle button. It has no relevance or whatsoever with the rehiring process. It simply allows you uh, to know if this employee comes back. So when you hire this employee, for instance, and if you're working with thousands of employees, you create a new record, and a new record would show up. A new record, what I mean by a new record is like old existing record would show up upon hiring, that this record already exists, and then you can click on that record and you'll see if it's a rehire. This basically will give you an indication that there could be some notes associated with it. If you do not put this rehire button, then you shouldn't be hiring that employee, and then you can investigate more on that profile itself, that what made the HR manager who terminated this employee non-eligible for a rehire. So that's where that toggle button kind of plays a role. So it's a process-based, more of a process-based, of course, than it is from a functionality perspective. So some things that you need to be aware of. The personnel action, just how we talked about the change in position, a personnel action for termination is required. And a workflow is embedded in the personnel action type. So we'll select termination workflow. So benefits management, if this employee was ever enrolled in benefits, then the termination date and the coverage end date is the same. And that makes sense. But at times when there are cases where employees are terminated, but they keep their benefits for a longer period of time, especially in a case when they're retiring, for instance, then you can change this coverage end date. But of course, you have to be very careful on how you design it. So from a system perspective, you would have the coverage end date to never, so you don't need to expire, for instance, their benefits, yet they are terminated. So your design, when you come up with the integration between payroll and the active workers, for instance, who needs to get paid, and your benefit provider, you need to be very careful on making sure that you take up all the points, integration points, as like relevant ones, and to make sure that the coverage end date does not compromise, for instance, against your employment because they're terminated employees. So a lot of things go into account when you want to build a design from a process perspective. The compensation, of course, you want to end their compensation. That's the toggle button automatically enabled. Variable compensation, we'll talk about it, but the variable compensation has to do with bonuses, for instance, one-time bonuses. So these are also toggled, turned on automatically based on the termination, and you obviously don't want to turn this off just because this is what they get paid. So after termination, they shouldn't be getting paid unless an absolute off the record scenario happens, and then you need to accommodate that employee. The leave enrollments we'll talk about. So this is the enrollment piece for leave of absence, and that also gets toggled, turned on based on the termination date. So when they're terminated, their accruals should stop occurring. The checklist for offboarding, something we've talked about a little bit when we were changing the position, so we don't want to touch base on that just yet because it's a separate scenario, separate videos to take on, and it's simply a submodule on top of HR. So we'll click continue, and you'll be directed to do some of the same form that you had seen for change position, and exactly the same information. So checklist is there. Personal action type is basically my information and some of the things that I've already put together. You could see the benefits I had it turned off, so it's still turned off. At any point I want to turn it back on, I can do so before submitting this to an approval, for an approval. I can even put comments in there. So if I wanted to add some comments prior to sending this out for an approval based on whatever the workflow looks like, my hiring manager or a specific person within the organization who takes care of these terminations, we can do so they can access these comments when they're approving it, and simply just click complete. So complete is you will only see complete when the workflow is turned off. You would see a submit button here instead if the workflow is working and turned on. And I also wanted to touch base a little bit about the message log and the work action history. So these are to do with the workflow that is enabled. So if you submit a workflow, then you can go into the work action history to see what the status is of that employee and where that workflow stands or sits, I guess, in this case. And then you can look into even more detail on who is supposed to be approving this, and you can reach out to them if it's not approved. But workflow itself should be configured in a way that within 2 days or a week, if this employee of this action hasn't been completed, it gets designated or delegated to another person automatically, so that you can do on a workflow level. So you wouldn't need to go through work action history, but that's like more like a audit. So once you press complete, then this employee would be terminated, and you would see this employee in the past workers. So if I were to just go into human resources, and we see past workers here, if you were to go click on past records, you will see this employee based on the effective date. And that is how you actually terminate an employee in human resource model. It's not very difficult, but you just want to make sure that the configuration is in place and you know how the process works. And with that, I will leave this to you to go through. I will simply just delete this action, and we're going to start talking about the employment type, and then we'll also discuss about worker action history a bit more in detail in the next video.